Welcome to Generations, a show which helps people 50 and better lead happy, healthy, and productive lives. Here's today's moderator, Gloria Van Demeltrot.
Hello, and welcome to Generations. We're delighted to have our audience with us. I'm Gloria Van Demeltrot, and I'll be your moderator today. I'd like to introduce my co-hosts. First, on the end, we have Nadia Jordana, our good friend, and we're delighted to have you with us today.
I'm always happy when I get to be here.
Wonderful. I think we have an interesting show. And we have Beverly Crosby. Welcome, Beverly. We're so glad to have you on this side of the table.
Yes, I know I'm really going to enjoy this topic today. Really excited to learn a lot more about what you are going to present to us.
Wonderful. Thank you. And that brings us to introducing our guest, Cathy Cowen. We are so happy to have you. Cathy Cowen is a death doula, which is a fascinating term and a fascinating subject for us to talk about today. Welcome, Cathy.
Thank you, Gloria.
Can you tell us a little bit first about your background, about you first, and then we'll get into our wonderful topic.
Thank you, and it's great to be here with you ladies. I actually grew up the oldest in a family with lots of kids, and in that meant that I was exposed to the older generation of my family in many different ways, but I also, in the last couple of years, have begun as a hospice volunteer writing life stories for patients. And so what that is legacy work. And so people have said to me, oh, that must be a terribly depressing job, when in fact it's been amazing and inspiring to work with people at this time of their life when they're facing something new that they haven't done before, and to work at creating a legacy for them. From that, I then, in the last 2 years, have decided to take the training to become a death doula. Some people call them death midwives, some people call them death coaches. It's a new and very holistic addition to a hospice team or to a hospital team. And I've just completed my training this year.
How long has the term death doula been around? It's new to me. I mean, I know what doula means, but only in the last month have I heard the term death doula.
Well, it's been around for a long, long time because there have been people to accompany family and patients at the end of their life, but it's really just been since 2007, 2008 here in the United States that there's been training and that there's been really a focus on accompanying a patient or their family through the end of their life. Hospice has had a big impact on that because hospice has become so mainstream now. We're seeing a lot of people familiar with and using hospice. The services of a doula complement hospice.
Okay, you mentioned that you work with the hospitals. Did I hear that right?
Not actually. We are actually hired by patients and then their families to be a guide or to accompany a patient and a family through the whole process of death. So that may happen at the diagnosis time. It may happen when someone is looking to plan a vigil. It may happen when a relative is out of town and they don't want their family member to die alone. A doula can come alongside a patient at any time in that process. Right now, there isn't a formal job description for a doula, so hospitals aren't necessarily the place that you would find one.
Where would you find?
Right now, if you were looking for a death doula, you may use Google. You'd probably get on your computer and take a look. There are a couple of organizations nationally that would direct you to local doulas. I actually did my training through the Conscious Dying Institute out of Colorado. INELDA, which is the International End-of-Life Doula Association, is another great resource. So that's probably where you would find a doula if you were looking now.
Can you tell us what exactly you do? What do you do when someone calls you and asks you about accompanying their loved one or themselves through the dying process? What do you do?
It's so interesting because there isn't a cookie cutter right now. What we have is a situation where someone may want just legacy work done. For example, I've been a hospice volunteer as a legacy writer. That means that I write life stories for people at the end of their life.
And I can relate to that because that's how we both have
Right.
been involved in that.
And I'm
too.
so grateful to you for introducing me to that, because that is a type of death doula work.
Okay.
In a bigger picture, death doulas are also trained to be curative, to be healing, not curative. And so what that means is, I may come into a situation alongside the nurses and the caregivers through hospice, not necessarily in a medical role, but in a more holistic role, dealing with the spiritual, the emotional, and some physical things with not only the patient, but the family. I can help the family understand the stages of death so that they feel empowered and so they know what's happening with their loved one. I can also work very closely with the patient to create a plan, whether that may be a plan for a memorial or a celebration of life. Many people, when they come to this point of their life, which is new and which most people haven't come to before, don't know who to talk to about it. And so as a death doula, my training has given me questions to ask, ideas to put forth, to explore for the person and or for their family.
Fascinating. Can you share some of those questions with us that you might ask the person?
I certainly can. We are trained to ask the difficult questions. And what I mean by that is to step in and step alongside of someone who may be in a suffering space and not to move away. We lean in to ask what things might be unfinished at this point, what things might need more attention. One of the things I've done frequently is to help to write letters to family members who will live beyond the patient. And in that, there's a sacredness about death and a sacredness about the process that is returned, which is really lovely.
Can you tell us, it sounds like, some people might think it sounds like very difficult work, and it might be for the most people, but yet it can also be very rewarding as well for yourself as a doula. Can you give us an example of, without using names of course, can you give us an example or a story that was really
In fact,
special?
part of the reason that I'm drawn to this work is that from 2016 to 2018, I lost 9 close family members and friends. And not any surprise. I wouldn't, as a writer, I wouldn't even write that into a storyline of a book. That's a very unusual thing to have that
No
much
one would
loss.
believe it.
No
Yeah,
one would
yeah.
believe it. But what that did for me was to put me in the space of realizing that there were very few resources available. And so, circling back to your question, one of the things that I would use as a standard example is that when a family brings in a death doula accompanies the hospice team, which then may change to a palliative care team. Palliative care is becoming more popular, where we stop receiving medication or where we stop receiving an aggressive or an assertive medical care. So a death doula will transition with those different teams that come to work with the patient. And so what I would say is probably my most typical path is to meet someone when they receive a diagnosis. And usually that's a really difficult time, a challenging time, and there are many, many questions. And so part of my role at that point is to put options together. And those questions that might be difficult to ask usually bring out a lot of possibilities for the way to proceed. With some patients, I may meet them at that diagnosis time and not meet them again until they come to a time of doing some planning. But with some patients, we set a regular schedule and we do some progressive work, bringing out their dreams and their hopes for a really good end of life. And I'd like to say part of what's happening and part of the evolution of the death doula is that people are really reimagining what death can be. People are really, on a very broad scale across not only our country but the world, stepping in to say, how can we end on a very positive note. A lot of times people ask me if this is a difficult job to do, and I do come back to saying it's one of the most rewarding things that I've done, in really, not only because I went through it myself and I wanted more resources, but because I know that what I'm doing makes a difference. So that's very rewarding.
How
You know,
fascinating.
This is something of a movement, as I read, that in recent years across the country, and such a positive thing. Is there any pushback, any negativity to the advancement of a movement like this?
You know, that's a great question. If there's anything, I would say that it's fear. People are afraid to talk about this subject, partly because we as a society have been so removed from it at this point. Prior to Western medicine and really our 20th century, most people did die at home. And at this point, in the hospice organization has done an end-of-life poll, and 9 out of 10 people who have a terminal diagnosis would like to die at home. And the statistic is that between 60 and 70% of those folks die in a hospital setting at this time. And then the remaining 20% generally are in a care facility. So as people are opening the conversation more, and maybe death is being brought back from the fringes of the topics that we don't talk about, there's less tension about it. And I have a great quote to share around that. John Underwood started a movement called the Death Cafe. And he's from England, and there have been, since 2011, over 9,000 death cafes held. Basically, it's a discussion of death over tea, dessert, usually held in a public place. And his quote is, just like talking about sex won't make you pregnant, talking about death will not make you dead. And I think that really helps us to see that there really is a death positive movement. And the more that we are open to and have those discussions, the better it is. So to be really succinct with my answer, the most difficult thing is people's fear. And stepping into a situation where a family is filled with fear, or perhaps the patient is filled with fear, and to continue to be as authentic as possible.
I also think that within families, you've got, let's say the matriarch of the family is aged and about to die. It's typical, at least I think in my experience, in family units, that it's awkward and uncomfortable for the immediate family to even acknowledge that that's really what's going to happen, or even have that conversation with the person that, yes, we all know you're dying. And what do you say? Can a death doula ease that awkwardness and get that dialogue going? Because it's really healthy when you do talk about it.
You've really, I think you've summarized it beautifully, because a death doula can come in and ask for photos and ask the bereaved family members or the grieving family members to take an action and open up something that then brings out the stories that really are what helps us to heal as someone is transitioning. So you're right, as a death doula, we come into the situation and read where the difficulty may be, and very sensitively and respectfully ask questions of those family members, because once the stories start coming out, that floodgate usually opens, and then there's just more and more people who want to come and share their stories. Additionally, sometimes it's that matriarch or the patriarch that does not want to talk about it. And in that situation, when there's a private one-on-one conversation and it's safe and it's more comfortable, I've seen a lot of healing happen. A lot of people are willing to share and answer those questions, and will be able to transcend that in order to honor their children or the people around them who may be fearful.
Would you say that the majority of the people want to talk about their experiences? You're talking to 3 storytellers right here. And I have found that aging people, they love to go back in time. They love to tell the stories. brings a smile to their face. But yet sometimes the family members are the ones who don't, they think it's going to
Exactly.
bother them.
Right.
Do you find that to be true?
In fact, nearly 100% people are so excited to tell their story and to share and to realize that it is the time of life when they are going to be leaving something behind. Whether that legacy is in a story, generally it's much more than our possessions or our financial things that we leave to our family. So I would say very much so. People are really excited to share their stories.
I am so delighted to hear about this. I didn't know what you did at all, what the death doula would do. I'm also a hospice volunteer, so I see many, many people who are in the process of dying. What I come across many times is not in the patient. The patients are not afraid of dying normally at that situation. The family is. And I think each of us personally knows someone who is terribly afraid of death and afraid to talk about it. Maybe historically that's been true. Do you find that to be lessening or changing in any way? Are people more open to talking about dying? It's going to happen to all of us.
Right.
And we don't like to think about it, or plan for it. And what you're saying in the death doula activities is that it's okay to open this up.
Yeah. Well, I would add a couple of ideas for you, and that is, right now, if you opened your community education booklets, you would see things on estate planning and things on end-of-life planning. And in fact, there's been in the St. Paul area here some conversation held by death doulas, and those classes have been well attended. So the trend is very much, yes, Gloria, that people are stepping into this time and asking questions with curiosity. And I think that when given the permission and the invitation, a doula can come in and bring those questions to the forefront in a gentle way, not with a lot of fanfare, but in a way that's sensitive and that draws on our history. Our long, long history is to honor those who are dying through much more than just a casket and flowers.
Wonderful. I find that healthy. I find that healthy to be able to understand that. I have a friend right now, I know a person who is in the final months of his life, and his wife is not admitting that. She's not admitting that, and I find that a real problem in how can I help them do that, by encouraging hospice, and then the person would say, oh, no, he's not ready for that. Well,
They're the ones who aren't ready for it.
exactly,
Right.
exactly, and that's a misunderstanding, I
And it
think
helps make
that-
everyone else uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
Afraid to say
Unfortunately,
something.
right.
Yeah.
And I think there are more movies that portray death as a natural part of life. There are more stories that we're hearing and seeing around us that portray the natural progression. And in fact, the statistics show that in the next 20 years, we expect to have an increase in the death rate by 30%. Of course, that's due to the baby boomers.
The baby boomers,
Right.
absolutely.
And so as we experience that kind of an increase around us more and more, we can't help but step into and maybe take a closer look at that process. For your friend, it may take a trusted confidant, it may be a stranger who comes in as a doula that is able to step in and walk alongside of that person. There's a lot happening that allows us to open up topics now that have been on the fringes for a while. And being a death doula is one of those. People often say to me, when you go to a party, you don't tell people you're a death doula, do you? It would be like a total conversation stopper. And it's actually quite the opposite. Because nearly everyone has a story about a relative that they adored, someone who was so dear to them and who they have lost. And so I think that what was an old way of looking at things is really changing, breaking away little by little. And I find the people who I trained with as a death doula were all committed to one thing, and that is seeing the progression of our life as a natural flow and a natural timeline, and not impeding that or hiding that. Minnesota has a Minnesota Death Collaborative, and that organization is composed strictly of doulas, all of us death doulas, and all in different areas. Some really specialize in end-of-life vigils, spending time and round-the-clock time. Some do legacy work. So the Minnesota Death Collaborative would be an excellent resource. There's also something called the Minnesota Threshold Network, and what that is, they deal more with an at-home visitation and vigil and a green burial. So they really focus on taking back that process and really taking ownership of how someone leaves the world. So those two would be two good resources for you.
You used the term green burial. Could you explain that
I
for those of
could.
us who don't really understand what that means?
We are at the very beginning. Well, we are well into, but we are as a whole learning more and more the fact that we do not need to be buried in a casket here in Minnesota. Here in Minnesota, we know some about cremation with fire, cremation with flame. We also have a process, a water cremation that was created and invented at Mayo Clinic that takes the same amount of time, that does not have the same effect that a fire cremation might happen. So that water hydrolysis is the process. That's another option for cremation. Additionally, there are 3 very well-known cemeteries here in the Twin Cities that have what might be called a memory forest, and/or are considered to be green eco cemeteries, and they're growing in number. The 3 that are the most popular, the largest, one in Inver Grove Heights, one on Larpenteur Avenue, and then one up in Brooklyn Park.
I'm confused about that water process. What does that do if you were to compare it to cremation? What does the water process do to the remains?
It's a great question. It actually reduces the remains to ash, just like cremation. And it does it with a hydroxide and water combination together. So it's a chemical process.
It removes the water from the body. Then.
Right.
We're
And what you're left
98%
with-
water, aren't we?
We are. What you're left with after about a 3-hour process
Okay, so it's a
is
removal
ash.
of the
The
body's water, not dunking them in a tank.
No, you are right. You are right on that, Nadia. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for
All
being
right,
being clear
One
on
moment
it.
of levity.
And with that,
was good.
essentially, the thing that people may decide to choose, one of the reasons people may choose that is that things like pacemakers don't need to be removed. There's some things that don't need to happen to have that type of cremation. And then there's a whole different amount of energy expended and used around that as well. It's the same amount of time, about 3 hours for cremation, and the remains are then ash, just as they would be with a fire cremation.
Interesting.
Never knew about that.
I never knew it
Ever.
either.
There's so much. There's so much happening right now in the Twin Cities and moving out into the greater, the outer parts of the state as well. In Inver Grove Heights, they actually have an area where they don't use markers or tombstones. Actually, they'll use natural things for tombstones, and they've created what is called a memory forest as well. You can actually choose to be buried at the base of a tree, and these things are
and that's your marker.
So these things are more and more becoming available. My role as a doula is to provide all of those options to a family that may not even have known they existed.
How interesting. You've opened up a whole
I know,
new
a huge
chapter of, a book,
Good.
basically a book
Good.
of something that I didn't know was available.
Yeah,
And it also, could you go back to this green burial, in addition to not having a marker and maybe having a tree or a bush or a flower maybe as a
Right.
marker, what else do they do is included in the green burial?
That's a great question. Right now, you can design your own service. So many people will buy a casket made of cardboard or a paper, and then they have their family and friends and relatives decorate it. So maybe when
goodness.
someone knows that they're approaching the end of their life, they'll actually have all of the grandkids come in with markers and
Yes.
cover that
That would
with
be
messages.
sweet.
It's a
Oh.
lovely option, and it's a wonderful way to honor the person who's passing.
Yes.
And then that box, which will break down very quickly, obviously very different than a casket, that box is then put into the earth. I've seen a situation where the grave site was prepared and the family actually stepped into and covered the grave site with flowers. So that all of the four walls into the earth were covered with flowers pressed into the sides, so that when the box was lowered, and their loved one
Was
was
surrounded
lowered,
by flowers.
surrounded by that.
How
So
beautiful.
green burials can range from what I just described to something very, very simple. It really depends on what the family would like, what the person who's passing would like, and we have that available here in the Twin Cities for us.
How
This has all
interesting.
been very recent. You said maybe from 2006 or 7?
Yes, it really, the first green cemetery in Minnesota was opened in Invergrove Heights in 2010. So that, I would say the advent of these green burials has really come on board since 2010. There have been, in Europe, they've got a lot more latitude than we've had here as far as rules and things in our country. So I suspect that it probably has been going on for quite a while, but for us in Minnesota, it's really been in the last decade.
How fascinating.
I know. I had no idea.
I didn't either. I didn't either. I knew, and Cathy has talked about this before, but this sounds fascinating.
It really
and
is.
you're recently involved in this. How recently?
I actually just completed my training earlier this year. I completed it through the Conscious Dying Institute, and what that means for me is my training took place over 2 windows of time, 2 weeks of very intense training, and we focused on not only knowing the stages of death and being able to help a family understand the process that their loved one is going through, but also to be familiar with all of these resources that I'm sharing with you today.
Wonderful. Our time is really fleeting fast, and I think we expected this to be a fascinating subject, and it truly is.
Good.
Thank you so much, Cathy Cowen,
you.
for being here and sharing this information with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Gloria.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nadia Jordana. This has been wonderful information,
I
right?
learned so much.
I did too. And Beverly Crosby, thank you for being with
Oh,
us.
It's been my pleasure, and thank you, Cathy. It's been wonderful.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
And to our audience, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on Generations.